You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wiradjuri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to yet another edition of Radio MMT. How are you today, Anne?
Hello, Kev. I'm good. I love the way you say yet another.
Yeah, well, it is. It's yet another. We've been doing it for a while now. So.
We have. And today we are going to have a listen to a conversation that you and I had, Kev, with James Rosier, who is a student of Modern Money Lab. So James is studying economics from the MMT perspective, and he will be taking us on a journey through the twists and turns of a government trying to, as the economists say, mobilise its resources.
In Italy, is it?
In Italy, yeah.
Right.
So we're heading off to Italy later in the show.
Right,
but
cool.
Before that, I do need to ask how you've been.
Yeah, I want to talk about van life. And the reason I want to talk about van life is because it's got to do with economics. There's more and more people living in mobile homes as opposed to static homes, and I'm one of them. And so I thought I'd talk about it a bit.
I know the van life can have its ups and downs because I get these photos. Sometimes I see you near this fantastic scenery right out the front of your door. And then other times I hear you say, I'm stuck in traffic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not just stuck in traffic. I was stuck in Melbourne last year during winter, and van life is as good as it is when the door is open. Because living in a van when the weather is not so great is not so great. You're sort of stuck in like a little box. If you're in some sort of dwelling which is larger than a van and it's cold, it's more comfortable. But when you're in a van, you sort of feel it. If you're in a van, you're quite exposed to the exterior weather. It's right there. Like as soon as you open the door, you're there, and you can get nice and cozy in your van. So the thing to do is to travel with the weather. But the reason I'm living in a van, it's kind of like it's a choice, which is better for me than it is for some people. Some people are in their vehicles, and that might just be a station wagon or a sedan, and they're in their vehicle because it's come to that. They've run out of options and they just need to stay somewhere. I'm not in that position. I made a conscious decision to...
You were renting, weren't you, before you...
I was renting.
And you were kitting out your van while you were renting.
Well, I've been a homeowner. I bought a home with my partner at the time, and when we went our separate ways, I stepped away from home ownership and into the rental market, and I was in the rental market for over a decade, and I'd been in the rental market prior to home ownership.
Do you see yourself as a van person as part of this housing crisis that everyone talks about?
Well, yeah, because, look, I could still rent, but I'm 62 and I work physically, and working long days gets harder and harder. And when I rent, every month you've got to come up with the rent, and it keeps on growing, and the bills and the rest of it. So stepping away from that obligation of having to pay at the end of the month means that I can control my work environment a bit more. I don't have to work as hard, and I'm aiming towards working less as I'm getting older. I'm approaching the retirement age in 5 years' time, and I don't want to be in a situation where I have to keep on working hard to pay the rent.
So how long have you been in the van now?
2.5 years, more than that.
Oh, that's plenty of time now to say whether it's working. So is it working?
It suits me. Okay,
Right.
But I think you have to be a specific sort of person. For me, it works because I like like travelling. I was a roadie back in the 80s. I don't mind being on the road. I quite like it, you know. The funniest thing is there's an anxiety when you start van life of not knowing where you're going to be sleeping on any particular night. Quite often I'll finish my day and I go, oh, we're all stay tonight. I don't know. And you feel a kind of anxiety about that. But that's dissipating, and now that anxiety is being replaced with not having everything with me all the time.
So if you're away from the van, that's where the anxiety comes in.
Yeah. For instance, I haven't got my van with me tonight. I'm fixing up another van. Okay, so I'm doing. Right. So I grabbed the other van.
Right.
And I haven't got all my stuff with me.
It's like changing your handbag.
Yeah, no. So now I get anxious when I haven't got everything with me all the time. So
interesting.
So it's a different thing, but it's taken the pressure off
financially.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of other things that become advantages when you're in a van if you've got yourself set up properly. And
what do you mean by set up properly?
Well, I've got a nice big van. I've got a comfortable bed.
You can stand up in it.
I've got a shower in it. I've got cooking facilities. It's a little home. It's got literally everything I need. Plenty of room. It's like a little 3-ton truck. I can understand if there are other van lifers out there, people who have been forced into living a vehicle and things are cramped. It would be a different story. It would be hard, and for them it would be a very different story. And so I don't want to glamorise it from that point of view.
But you're talking about how you've made it work for yourself.
Yeah, I had the time and the resources to set myself up properly in the van, and I'm still exploring. It's 2.5 years, and I'm still modifying things, and I'm still exploring how to do it. I'm just about to head up the East Coast when it starts getting cold, and I'm going to try and establish a network up the East Coast with handyman work. So most of my work is word of mouth. I still need to work. I'd need to work a lot more if I wasn't in the van. But I've got to establish new networks with people in places where I'm not known, and that means I've got to go, do some cold selling. The interesting thing is people say, oh, it must be lonely living in the van. I'm finding the opposite, because wherever I'm travelling, I'm always seeing whether I know somebody in that area, and so I'm being far more social than I otherwise would be, because wherever you go, oh, hang on, I know somebody who lives not too far from here, and you'll go and drop in, even if you don't know them that well. You just say, listen, I'm in the hood. Do you want to catch up for a coffee, and we'll catch up, etc. And then you meet other people on the road and stuff like that as well. So
I have to say, my experience of you, Kevin, when you drop by, is you're a very light guest. Like sometimes I can't even feed you breakfast because you insist on cooking in the van.
Well, I've got my own stuff. It's like, breakfast is sacred.
It's a sacred act. So all you do is use the shower or the bathroom every now and then. That's about it.
Yeah, and I don't need to do that. I'm fully self-contained with what I've got. But water is the interesting thing.
Okay.
I can fill it with diesel. I can go to the supermarket and buy food. I can get a top-up for my soda stream. But trying to find water for the water tanks, there's no socially acceptable way of filling up 120, 130 litres of water. So I have to stealth. Like if I see a tap,
stealth fill.
I stealth fill. I've got the tap adapters and all that sort of stuff. So generally I go to sporting reserves and that sort of stuff, and I'll find a tap which always has the handle taken off, but I've got the handle myself. So
right,
and I'll just fill up. I used to be kind of coy about it. Now I'm quite
just out in the open, just filling up.
Yeah, I'm just filling up my van. If anybody has an issue with it, which occasionally they do, not often, I go, rightio, well, if you can tell me a better place to fill up, I'll go fill up. But this water, 100 litres, probably costs about 30 cents. I'll give you 50 cents if you like, and you can pay it to somebody if you know who to pay it to. But
3CR. Tell us about, like, when you said you don't know where you're going to be each night. So how are you calculating that, and what kind of places are you finding? Because it's a bit unusual, isn't it, to be a van lifer in a major metropolitan city?
Yeah, like I haven't come across many people doing what I'm doing, which is working in the city and van lifing. Spending a lot of time in cities, trying to get out of the city. I'd like to get far more coastal than this.
But when you are in the city, where do you end up at night?
Well, I always look for sporting reserves. They're the best place because they've got facilities, they've got a bit of space. So if I can find a nice sporting reserve that has a good flat car park, which is not too close to traffic, That's where I'll go. Along the Yarra, there's plenty of spots. I'm not going to divulge my favourite spots, but I've got some views that my neighbours paid a lot more money than I did for, I can tell you. But,
What are the ideal characteristics for a good night? So flat surface?
Flat is good.
Flat is good for sleeping?
I've got some wooden chocks to flatten my van out a bit because often it leans over to the passenger side because that's usually the camber of the road.
What about a toilet?
If they've got a loo, that's good. They lock the loos up after the sun goes down. I go, people still need to go to the loo after. If anybody out there has some control over this, I love it when the loos are left open all night. There's a few places I know where they don't lock them up, but they sort of say, bad things are going to happen in loos after dark. I'll tell you, bad things are going to happen outside the loo after dark if you keep them locked up the whole time. So look, I've got my own facilities in the van.
So flat surface, a loo's nice.
Trees.
Away from trees?
Trees, it's a nice parky environment with trees and stuff. And often where I park is where people walk their dogs in the morning. So
have you ever had anyone intruding on you?
I've had three people try to graffiti my van. And
you have a way of wiping it off straight away.
Yeah, that's the thing, is get it off straight away because I can't have my van looking like I'm trying to be stealth parking. I don't need it to.
You want to be anonymous.
Don't want to draw attention. So I need it left alone and just look nice and bland and
you've got
non-obvious.
A little 3CR sticker on there now.
Yeah. But there you go. There's my first instalment of van life.
First instalment of van life.
I reckon we'll talk about it a bit because a lot of people ask me about it. It's a different way of living and it's pretty good if you do it right.
Well, maybe we could have a listen to our conversation that we had with James Rosier. So the issue there with Italy, Kevin.
Yeah.
What would you do if you're a country with high mass unemployment and your housing stock was badly in need of a thermal upgrade? What would you do? That is what we are going to find out when we speak with James.
Right here, we'll head into our interview with James Rosier.
Well, today we welcome back to Radio MMT James Rosier, who is a local to Melbourne advocate of modern monetary theory, or MMT, and he is a student of the postgraduate course in MMT and Ecological Economics, which is run by Modern Money Lab. Hello, James. Good to be speaking with you again.
Hello, Anne. Hello, Kev. How are you?
Hi, James. I'm well.
Well, James, last time we spoke with you, that was back on episode 36, and you told us a story about a country and its relationship to money. And that country, of course, was Cambodia. And the question then was whether the Khmer Rouge regime managed to abolish money. And people can go back and listen to that episode to find the answer. But more recently, you've investigated another country. And in this case, it is Italy. And I believe part of what we'll be looking at is its relationship to taxation. And in both cases, your research was prompted by the MML course that you are doing. And these examples are interesting for what they tell us about how monetary systems operate in practice. And of course, MMT is all about analysing how monetary systems really work. Now, James, I gather it was your experience prior to learning about MMT that drew your attention to this particular moment in Italy's economic history. So before we jump into the story about Italy, tell us about that connection to the issue.
Well, for several years I worked in home thermal efficiency. So basically going into houses and installing insulation and draft proofing. I did a lot of that physical work myself, but as things evolved, I ended up developing administration, some of the IT work and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I was involved in a lot of state and local programs that were looking at these kind of renovations for people in vulnerable positions, people on low incomes, some people with disabilities, chronic diseases, the elderly, and the sort of people who often most benefit from those kind of installations because they tend to have poorer quality housing in the first place and then often don't have the money up front to get them installed. If you have any sort of chronic issues, disabilities and such, sometimes that can mean that you're particularly sensitive to temperature.
Oh, of course.
We would have clients who had less tolerance for the extremes, either hot or cold. But for the same reason, they might have had poorer access to the means to fix that up and poorer access to advocate for themselves to mitigate that. So you've got all these kind of compounding effects. So those kind of programs were quite rewarding.
I've heard this term energy poverty. So is that what these people are experiencing?
So in some of the work I was doing, we used the term energy stress, which is kind of a related term, and that's, I guess it's not as severe. But energy poverty, basically the way I'd like to think of it is you have trouble either heating or cooling your home, either because you don't have the physical resources are not there, like the structure of the home, and you do not have the money to pay the energy bills. That can be for many complex factors. You can imagine two people with the exact same income circumstances, but one is living in a leaky home built in, say, the 1970s, and another one is living in something that was built to code in the last couple of years. They might not even need to turn their heater or their cooler on for many days because it's already keeps itself at a level temperature.
Just to confirm that, like my job as a handyman, I've spent a lot of years fixing minor problems with rental properties, and I was forever sealing gaps and the rest of it in overcrowded cheap rentals that weren't thermally efficient. And the client might own this rental property, then you go to their house, and their house is smick. It's got all the latest everything in it. It's pretty apparent that energy efficiency follows income trends.
And so it sounds like, James, that insulation is a really important part of the quality of your home, because what we're talking about basically is temperature control.
Yeah, I mean, the things that we used to talk about are sort of price, because the cost of heating and cooling can take out a huge portion of people's budgets. Then there's comfort, and if your home goes outside of certain temperature ranges, that actually has implications for health. There's obvious implications for people living in too cold, too hot homes, poorly ventilated, too damp homes. And then there is the carbon footprint. Obviously, if you're using a lot of energy because the home is inefficient, then you're having a bigger impact on the environment. That would be the most important thing to me, but people tended to be most concerned about price than comfort. The good news is that you can sort of tackle all three.
It's a win-win-win. Yeah.
It's really interesting. We did a lot of work in the private sector outside of these programs, and we would almost universally get people, I would say, who are sort of in that middle income band who wanted to get stuff done, typically in areas that had sort of like a greener demographic. They would be more aware of these kind of measures. But obviously you don't get the poorest people doing these kind of interventions on their own bat. And sometimes you don't get the wealthiest people either.
I was about to say, I've got a couple of examples where at the top end of the income bracket, they don't care how much energy costs.
Exactly.
And a lot of them don't care about the environment. And I've worked on places where they have enormous three-phase power to heat the enormous slab in these cavernous mansions that they've got. So there is a section of the community, extremely wealthy, who just do not give a stuff about how much it costs or what impact it has on the environment.
And here's the thing about that, when we would do audits of those big places. So let's say, you've just bought your mansion, 3-story McMansion, marble bathrooms. You've got these wonderful French doors that open up onto balconies. You've got all of this stuff, but you might be going, that door rattles or the wind blows through here. So the easiest thing then is to turn on your systems and you put them on full bore, and maybe you've got them on practically 24 hours a day. But because you've got such a high income, you just don't care, Now, if you do care and you got someone like the company I used to work for to come through and do the audit, here are the things that we think you should do. Then you turn around and say, it's going to cost a fortune to get this done.
The upfront cost.
They might say no. And the reason it's really expensive is you've got an enormous house you don't need.
Okay.
So you've got people who are insulated from,
no pun intended,
the effects of the environmental damage that they're doing. So it's no accident that you have this huge explosion in environmental impact at the higher end of the income scale.
Yeah, I know somebody who leaves their floor heating on 24/7, even when they're out of town for weeks at a time, because the dogs need to not have a cold floor to walk on.
Yeah.
I've also seen a school which had a change room and left, it would have been at least a dozen huge hot water systems on permanently, like all through the year. During the summer holidays, we had to go in and we had to fix some stuff. And I noticed that all these things are just ticking all the time. They might get used for a few months during winter when footy's on, but they just leave these enormous things on the whole year. There's inefficiencies all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these things are about the way things are designed. A lot of these things are about what people's income position is. And a lot of them are just behavioral. The things that we used to do and the things that I used to talk to clients a lot about was just like, hey, look, if we're going to seal up your house, things like your bathroom is going to be zoned out because you don't want all that moisture coming straight into your living room. And sometimes people they just don't actually know how their houses work, as bizarre as that sounds. So people think they need to have constant fresh air. Actually, opening your window for about an hour a day is very, very healthy, regardless of the circumstances.
So the price signal doesn't necessarily alter the behaviour here.
I mean, I think it definitely does. People do notice, when their bills are going up. But historically in Australia, we had really cheap energy for many, many years. So behaviorally, we forgot, how to do stuff. Architecturally, we forgot how to do things. Many buildings that were built in, say, the 40s have deep eaves and that sort of thing. So they were designed to cope with the weather. And then at some point, we're like, no, it's fine. We've got cheap gas, cheap coal. Maybe we'll get a pool in the backyard.
Okay.
So those things are real. But then there's also kind of baseline needs that people have and how they attend to those needs. Because if you go below a threshold of income and savings, you just never get off the ground.
Yep. So that's terrific, James. But what's all this got to do with Italy?
Okay, so Italy ran a huge program called the Superbonus. And the Superbonus is, I assume, called the Superbonus because it was a better bonus than their pre-existing program, which was called the Ecobonus, which gave people a 50 to 65% tax rebate on efficient upgrades, particularly to the wall insulation, but it might have been ceiling insulation too. So during the COVID crisis, Italy, like many nations around the world, decided to do some form of stimulus program. And like many nations around the world, they said, let's see what we can do for the construction sector. And as it happened, they already had sort of on the books various programs that looked at efficient renovations. As I said, there was already a program called the Ecobonus. And so they decided one of the things they were going to do was boost that number up to 110%, which is a big number, and it's bigger than 100, which means that if you did this kind of intervention, you could profit from it.
So if you're paying to get some insulation put into a building, they're giving you 110%.
So effectively, at the sort of the peak value of this, I think it was around 60,000 euros, which is bigger than the numbers in the programs I used to work with. You would effectively get 66,000 euros back. So you're getting effectively $6,000 credit back on top of what you put in. Now, it's a tax credit, and it was payable over, I think, 5 years. They buried that throughout the life of the program.
So it's tax deductible. So you have to be earning that much tax to reap the benefit of that program.
Exactly, Kevin. And people who are listening to the show are probably going, well, hang on. Doesn't that mean that only people who earn that amount of money can benefit from it? And historically, that's how these kind of programs have worked. Looking at the Ecobonus, which was this prior program, it went overwhelmingly to people with higher incomes.
Yeah.
So obviously, if you're not earning anything, if you're on a zero income, a tax rebate doesn't help you,
Right.
because you don't have tax to be rebated.
Yeah, well, even if you are paying tax, it's the same thing here. If you want to negatively gear something, you have to be earning enough tax for that to kick in. So if you're paying a little bit of tax, but you're getting a huge tax credit, well, you can only use a little bit of that for your tax credit. So it's restricting it to a higher income bracket for that scheme to work. However, having said that, essentially what you're doing is outsourcing your upgrading of the energy grid to rich folk.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is benefits, I believe, in doing this, even for people who are a bit wealthier, because people in the higher income scales splurge on energy use. Actually having some incentives there to change that behavior is a good thing. And actually having building construction firms learning how to do this type of thing, because they weren't really doing it beforehand, that's a good thing. So having incentives there are a good thing.
Is it still going?
It's been wound up.
Okay.
So there's sort of existing credits that exist. I think most of all the actual building works are done.
You're listening to 3CR 855 AM on digital and on the internet. www.3cr.org.au.
And there's also the issue of resources. Are the resources available to cope with that demand? Which is what we always talk about from an MMT point of view. It's the real resources that are the crucial factors. The money needs to be able to accommodate real resources. I guess if this program builds that resource, then they might be able to roll it out in a broader fashion.
Well, so here's the thing, Gavin. That's what they did. And they did it through some kind of clever, although ultimately, I guess we'll come back to that, unnecessary sort of innovations. What they did was they said, let's make these tax credits transferable. So in the first instance, you might give them to your supplier. So effectively, the supplier comes along and says, we'll do this upgrade for free. And then we effectively pocket that tax credit at the end. And then that's a thing for their books over the 5 years, right?
So if you didn't have that income that could take advantage of the tax credit, you could still go ahead and order one up.
Exactly. Regardless of whether you had the income. And then, in a similar vein, they said, actually, we'll facilitate this through a financial institution, like a bank, and the bank can hold on to that for their own reasons, or then they can on-sell them to third-party companies. So this is one of the things, this is a sort of a key piece of this program that made it far more equitable in sort of two ways. Firstly, because the 110% things, it means you're not paying out of pocket. And also because you can pass them on, your initial income is not necessarily a factor. In fact, actually, if you think about it, because the money that was available was there regardless of the type of home that you had. It varied a little bit for apartments, but it was generally basically the same. You could actually get more improvement for your home relative to the existing quality, existing size at a lower income scale, if that makes sense.
No.
Kind of, sort of.
Yeah, because if you've got a huge mansion, 60,000 euros might be peanuts to do an intervention there.
Radio, yep.
If you've got a little shack, then that might go a very long way to a better quality.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us. The Superbonus, Karen.
The Superbonus, yeah.
After speaking with James, I did a bit of an internet search on the Superbonus, and what I noticed was that a lot of the talk around the Superbonus was all complaining about how much it cost. So originally they were saying it was going to cost 35 billion euros over 15 years, And in the end, it actually cost 160 billion euros, and that was over 4 years. But of course, Kevin, despite all this government bashing about how it increased Italy's national debt, you and I would just say, phooey.
Yeah, we scoff at that. What we're seeing here is money being created, and it's effectively mobilising resources. That's what it's supposed to do.
And what's fascinating about the Superbonus story is that they didn't just spend the money and pay for people to get their houses insulated. What they did is they made tax credits, and then they made these tax credits transferable. So, did making these tax credits, were they actually creating a kind of money? And that's the question that we'll hear in the next part of our conversation with James.
This whole scheme was set up to mobilise resources, to mobilise the resource of renewables and energy efficiency into households. Was it effective? Did it mobilise that resource? How was the state of play before and after this scheme was introduced?
By some estimates, the necessary renovations that should have occurred to improve housing could have taken 630 years under the previous trend. At the height of the Superbonus, they estimated the change to Italy's housing stock would take about 10 years. Something like 0.2% of the estimated needed renovations of this type were happening in Europe, prior to this. This program ran for 3 or 4 years and made a substantial contribution. It's really difficult to get firm estimates on those because it's such a complex system, but also that the potential for fraud.
Well, there's always going to be fraud.
Yeah.
But I guess the summary would be is that it improved energy efficiency significantly.
Oh, without a doubt.
So it mobilised that resource, and
it also mobilised unemployed resources. So literally unemployed people. Yes.
This bears a direct comparison to the insulation scheme that Peter Garrett brought in under the Rudd-Gillard government that sort of went down in flames because the opposition said that the scheme was a complete failure because 4 people were killed during the implementation of this program. But the program actually insulated an enormous amount of houses in Australia that otherwise wouldn't have been.
The long-term implications of that reverberated for years. People would still go on about, the pink bat scheme. Oh, you're not using pink bats, like that particular product had anything to do with,
Yeah, it got politicised.
The other thing which occurs to me, surely I would have thought that the best response from governments would be to start implementing renewable energy into their systems so that they're insulated from these oil shocks. We've been held as hostages to OPEC since the 70s or since before then. If they decide to do something, we'll have to pay the price because they're controlling the oil. As soon as we break away from this petrodollar world that we live in, the better.
Sometimes that sort of stuff has happened. If you look at the oil shock in the 70s, the big cars of the time suddenly started becoming smaller.
Yeah.
That was a real thing, and people were like, oh, does it make sense to be driving a tank? I mean, I'm seeing tanks on the road now, so I would find it lovely if, the economics of oil made that absurd. One of the stats is that in the EU, housing is responsible for 40% of the carbon emissions.
Right.
That's a huge amount.
Yeah.
That's so much of the game. We tend to think about transport, which we should. That's a huge amount. But if your house is responsible for that much of the energy you use, and particularly if you're spending a lot more time there because you're no longer going into the office, you're working from home, or it's COVID or whatever, then that kind of number goes up. But some of these fixes are actually really easy. But yes, this program ran for a few years. Initially, it was a pandemic response. People are stuck in their homes, so they're experiencing the inadequacies of the heating and cooling. And then as Russia's invasion of Ukraine kicked in, then that had huge implications for gas supply.
Yep.
Italy's a major gas importer. Much of their household stock are on the gas there. So being wholly dependent on an external supply of energy, it makes no sense.
Back to this sort of real innovation with these tax credits, when now they're allowing people to pass on these tax credits around to each other, from the consumer to the service person doing the installation, or even to your bank who's fronting up the money to make this installation happen. This is almost turning these tax credits into money themselves, in that you can pass them on to a third party. So I was wondering how all that started playing out.
It is money-ish. And so depending on how transferable these credits were, they were more or less desirable. I had a look into this, like a huge market exploded in these credits. We're talking about financial institutions wanting to buy these, who then, because the financial companies can only absorb so many of these tax credits for the same reason that you and I would want only a certain amount of them, other third-party companies would be like, oh, we'll have those because it's cheap money. They'll pay some sort of transaction service fee to get them, but then they're holding on to them to have them on their books for some later time that they can discharge their tax liability at a lower amount.
We came across this in a previous episode, and we were talking about the mobile phone credit that people had.
Yeah, similar thing in sub-Saharan Africa.
An African nation, yeah, where people were using the credit on their phone as a form of exchange. And it helps you think about money. But then in all of these systems, the credit that's being applied is using the currency of that particular sovereign state as the basis of the exchange. So it might be telephone credit, it might be an energy tax credit, but it's still being calculated in terms of the sovereign currency.
Yeah, it's interesting in this instance because it's the Italian state that's running this operation, but the currency is the euro.
Let's remind people just what's going on with the Eurozone and the euro, and Italy being part of the Eurozone, because they've got a very different monetary system to what Australia has. And in fact, MMT would say that they are not monetarily sovereign, unlike Australia.
Actually, Italy does have their own central bank, as do all the members of the Euro Currency Union. But then they have the ECB, which is the central bank for the central banks. And they have these rules about, not exceeding a 3% deficit, which they effectively suspended during this crisis because they learnt how badly they've managed the sovereign debt crisis in the past, and they've kind of changed their approach there.
So they learned from after the GFC, because the European countries went into a real debt crisis for way longer than we did after the GFC, and that was because they simply weren't spending enough.
Effectively. So they were forced into austerity programs, which is the opposite of what you should do during a financial crisis. Italy's central bank and the Italian government can still spend at will. The problem is whether their bonds will be taken up by the market. And what was happening during the PEP program was the ECB was coming along and saying, yeah, we'll buy those. So if you want to think about it during this phase, Italy was much more of a monetary sovereign government than they were in the period prior to, and perhaps even now, because those rules of, rolling back into practice. It's very tempting to think of monetary sovereignty as a binary thing. I tend to think of it as sort of a scale that can slide in and out depending on policy stuff that's going on. And frankly, that's much better than it was in the past because it meant that you could deliver this program at will.
So you think they could have been spending beyond the 3% deficit without the ECB coming down on them for it?
Oh, effectively, because that's what was happening. Yeah.
So tax credits become a form of money, a form of payment. And as has been said, anybody can create money. It's just the ability to have it accepted that is the major hurdle. So this tax credit off the back of this scheme, once it starts becoming unstable with changes for its transferability, it then becomes less attractive as a form of money.
So, the government changed 3 times over the course of this program. They introduced, I believe, 14 different legislative changes to the way this system worked. And when you introduce changes, that introduces uncertainty into the system. So you give me €1 or $1, I know I can use that dollar to purchase anything that will take $1. You give me a tax credit and then the government starts umming and ahhing about whether that credit is eligible to be used, then it might not be as good.
Yeah.
And basically what happened is they came along at certain points and they're like, oh, wait, way too many people are taking up this amazing system that's doing all these incredible things that we were talking about just before.
Right.
We're a little bit more conservative in our thinking about how much a government should be, inverted commas, spending. And so we're like, let's tinker with the system. And so they would do things like, they would say, oh, you can't transfer this credit more than once or twice.
The money expires.
Yeah. Suddenly the value of these things drops. The market for them drops. And if your build depends on someone buying the tax credit at the end, there were stop works that were happening on construction sites, because they're like, we don't know how to get rid of these. And also then these small businesses that are doing the installations, hang on, we loading up with too many tax credits that our business can't support. And you've got small businesses that are run typically by 1 or 2 people who don't necessarily understand the administrative, legislative complexity that goes into the changes that are going on here.
Oh, yes.
So you've got sort of all these other little factors that are happening, which may then have benefited larger firms that can support
A tax accountant.
administrative staff that can be like, oh, the tax implications are this. I think it's great that they figured out a mechanism to increase the equitable distribution of this. And you can actually see this really lovely graphs that show, say, the Ecobonus, that program I mentioned before, the one that was...
The 630-year one.
the earlier one, that overwhelmingly went to upper income people. Well, this one was far more dispersed. And you can't tell exactly, but geographically you can tell that this went to municipalities in Italy that were much lower income.
So on the equity front, it was a success.
Yeah. But this financial instability stuff, a lot of that is a direct result of the tinkering with the program, which has created uncertainty in the market. But also the fact that you're selling them on, which is great because that's creating a way for lower income people to get rid of these credits to pass them on. But you've got to ask, who's buying these credits? And I looked into this. So the Italian bank Intesa Sanpaolo claims to have taken in something like 18 billion of the Superbonus credits.
18 billion.
They had about 50% of the purchases of the on-sold credit. So that's a smaller portion of the bigger program. So they're selling these to other companies. And I looked into their top clients, most of whom would claim to be players in renewable energy. But, you look at their names, they're like Ludoil and Grupo Uno Energy, and they're all legacy fossil fuel companies. So good and bad that a lot of these companies are like facilitating these green renovations, but I have to take some of that with a grain of salt.
So basically, we're benefiting dirty oil companies by trying to use less oil.
Maybe. I mean, effectively, there's a financial windfall for some of these fossil fuel companies and these financial institutions.
I guess you call it a transitional program, which has a good and a bad side to it.
Yeah.
So what would be the problem with these big corporations using these tax credits? Because from an MMT point of view, all that would do was increase your deficit in your budget. And from the MMT point of view, well, so what?
Well, exactly. So a tax credit means that money that would have otherwise been retired from the economy is not. It's still out there in the economy. Okay, well, Ludoil or whoever has that extra money to do with what they will, or the households have that money.
So there's more spending power left in the economy.
There's more spending that's going all around in the economy.
Would that have had an inflationary potential problem there?
So it's interesting whether this has an inflationary issue. I mean, the program as a whole, it didn't look like there was a huge inflationary impact. I mean, it's difficult to pass because there was so much of that going on at the time regardless. But I think it was the Italian Budgetary Office. They looked at something specific and they were like, did air conditioners and heaters become more expensive during this time?
Good question.
And they found that as distinct from the rest of the European area, yes, in Italy, they did become more expensive. And I tried to look into this to see how they calculated that, because if you imagine, how do you calculate inflation on a particular product category? Well, you have to track those products over time. So you buy this model of air conditioner this year, then what does it cost next year? If it's gone up by more than everything else, then that's more inflationary than the baseline. That's pretty easy. But what if the following year that previous model doesn't exist? Well, you have to do a substitution there. And the new model might have more bells and whistles on it. So it's more expensive anyway. So those kind of calculations, depending on how they're done, might be a bit misleading. And I was like, well, if you're substituting your traditional gas-fired heaters with split systems and other forms of electrical heating, which are typically more expensive up front but are cheaper to run, then as a category, they will become more expensive in Italy. You see what I'm saying here? So inflation may have been observed purely a consequence of moving to more efficient systems.
Yeah, more sophisticated equipment, which costs more, but then you factor in the life of that item.
Yeah.
It works out. So you're not replacing like for like. So it's very hard to say that that's inflationary or otherwise.
Yeah, might have got a false positive.
Exactly. And again, it's probably less of a problem than all the other benefits you get down the line. So, worrying about that. And I guess one of the points here is that many of the problems I have with this program, and I think overwhelmingly it was a good idea, is that it comes out of this tax credit model, which ultimately I think was actually not needed. So again, what you're doing when you take up the Superbonus program is you're deferring your tax payments to a point in future. And then in order to make that more equitable so that people who don't have high enough taxable income, they create a transferable tax credit system. And so what you're doing is you're increasing the complexity, the administrative load, the chances for fraud and financial things, they just kind of multiply the further you go out. Well, what they could have done to make it all a bit simpler was just say, actually, we're going to fund 60,000 euros worth of upgrades to your home directly.
I was wondering about that.
And there are reasons why they didn't do that. One was because they already had an existing program. So they were like, let's just do that, but bigger.
Okay.
It's easy. You do that. And then you're like, oh, hang on, that means this is only going to the richest people. Oh, let's do this and this. But again, that stems from an inadequate understanding of the money system, because they actually think that having the private sector involved in the financing is a crucial, necessary, and a more efficient part of this. And the other reason they didn't want to do that is because by deferring the payments and putting them as tax credits to be paid off in future, they could take that off budget. So we're not putting $60,000 on the Italian budget this year. We're doing 60,000 over the course of 5 years to be put onto future budgets. And as we know, and as your audience probably know, they're still stuck in that mindset of going, oh, we need to
Balance the books. Yeah.
We need to balance the books. And a couple of years into the program, Eurostat said, actually, what you're doing is against the rules. You have to define your budget balance based on when you implement a tax credit, not on when it gets paid off.
Right.
Oh.
So basically,
they were doing some creative accounting.
yeah, so they had to revise their 2023 deficit from 4.5% to 7.4. You know, it was just like, you know.
Oops.
So part of the rationale for that, gone. So again, all of these issues could have been simplified if they were just a little more comfortable in saying, the reasons we want to do this are really good. Let's mobilize these resources directly. Let's get those people employed directly. Let's renovate these houses directly and kickstart a laggard construction sector. You know, let's balance our home temperatures first. And the budget stuff is less important.
What you're saying was that had Italy spent public money on the public good directly, it would have been a more effective scheme. But that's difficult to do when you don't understand money the way we do in MMT, when you think you have to balance the books, and especially when you're held accountable by the ECB.
Exactly. The easiest and simplest and probably the most efficient thing to do is to actually have a reasonably designed but simple process where it's direct payments, I would have thought.
Yeah. Public money for public good.
Public money for public good. That's got a really good ring to it.
There's an idea. So James, is there anywhere where we can see more of your work?
Well, I've just popped up something on YouTube recently. It's called Fun with Emojis.
Okay.
It's not about the Superbonus, but it is about money, MMT, deficit myth, that sort of thing. You can look up James Rosier on YouTube or Fun with Emojis.
Fun with Emojis on YouTube. Well, thank you, James, for taking us on yet another jaunt overseas to have a look at when you apply your MMT lens to a specific time in history. And as always, I think the MMT lens cuts through the Gordian knot and tells you what is the most simple approach to anything.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's been interesting speaking to you. These kind of issues help us understand the nature of money a little bit more each time. So much appreciated.
No, thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, Kev, James's story about the Superbonus.
Yeah.
It just sounds like such a shaggy dog story where you've got this long-winded, roundabout, circuitous way of subsidising home insulation for low-income households.
Yeah, we've got to remember what's going on here. We're trying to mobilise resources that are required.
Right. We've got the insulation. We've got the people to put the insulation in. We've got people who want insulation. So what do? We just need the money.
We need insulation because we have a climate change and we use government money to do that. But because of the way governments misunderstand their operation, which is to say that they think they have to balance the books, the deficit myth we're talking about, we're forced to do all these very complicated gymnastics just to make what should be a fairly simple thing happen.
It's what they call realpolitik, Kevin.
Is it real? It's unreal to me.
I think ultimately we will give Italy 8 out of 10 for equity on that one, but 5 out of 10 as far as how they use their money to mobilise resources.
But the thing is, that, it worked. He said that it was going to take decades and decades.
600 years.
600 years to achieve the same.
Under the old system.
Yeah. So
Goes to show what you can do when you spend properly.
Yeah. Hey, we're running out of time. We've got to go.
See you next time, Kevin.
See you in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? They're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. We could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational expectation.
I think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.